I'd like to give an introduction to comparative government and politics. First, looking at a method of or methods of political analysis. So, first you would have empirical data, data points which are to reflect some reality in a country or in systems of government that you're comparing. You have normative statements, which are statements that are made of, are conclusions or discussion points based on that empirical data or data points. Of course, would have hypothesis, which is our guesses about what would happen in certain scenarios. Variables are basically different things that you can look at in when you're comparing countries or systems of governance. And then causation, that certain variables cause certain types of reactions in different government systems and such. You have independent variables which impact the dependent variable. You can change the independent variable and you can change that when you're looking at different countries. And then you have a dependent variable that depends on the independent variable looking at systems of governance. You have correlation between certain variables, certain ideas is something to look at. Now, looking more specific at topics about government, you have a civil society, the society in which people of a country or a group or a place that you're looking at, what are they doing to interact with their government, making certain interest groups and things of that nature? How are they looking to impact their government? You have informal politics, where people aren't. You have political officials not looking to, in a way of a law or a decree or specific statement, trying to impact society, but saying specific things, making decisions out of their official title, which informally affects a country, laws, political system, or even the whole world. Looking at power and authority, you have states. A state is basically an area which has autonomy to do whatever it like, power over a military, for power to do whatever is to be done in an area. So that could be militarily wise, it could be governance system, not someone who or some group which restricts the governance of that area. And usually the state would have several other people around the world, countries, it could be hundreds, could be a few, that would typically recognize that it's an independent state. You have institutions inside of the government. This could be legislative ones. A legislature could be an executive institutions. It's basically institutions which help the government to run. Sovereignty, the ability to execute actions and decisions that a government has on a certain population on their own land without a different country disrupting that or ruling it invalid. Nation, basically a group of people who possibly could share the same language, could share the same culture. Basically a group of people, a nation of people. Like you have the nation for the French people, the nation for the German people, the nation for the Russian people, stuff of that nature. Nationalism is that feeling of, or that great pride in the nation of the people that live in it, and the pride of a certain group of people for the nation that represents them. You have regimes. Regimes are basically the groups for the people that govern, a nation. And I mean, typically it's a nation. Sometimes it would be the state, because the state is the thing that rules. Sometimes it's a nation. These could be democratic or authoritarian. And there's a mix of other types, but usually those would fall into the two types. You have, when you're looking at democratic regimes, you have two types. You have indirect, where it would be basically people voting for representatives. Looking at some of the countries like Britain, you would have the House of Commons, or Russia, would have the Duma, or the president, or Mexico, you would have the Chamber of Deputies, or Iran, you would have uh, the Majlis, or Nigeria, could be one of the two houses of the government, or it could even be the president there. I mean, a lot of varieties in other states or other countries. I mean, you have members of parliament in Canada, you have House of Representatives in the United States. So that just varies around the world. But that's just basically a government official or indirect person that you would vote for to make decisions for you. It could be a mayor of a city, et cetera, et cetera. Direct democracy is basically where people are directly voting for what they want, whether it's a legislation piece. In like the state of California, it would be a proposition. As an example of direct democracy, could be a referendum, like the 1993 Russian Constitution, or I mean, it could be a referendum to leave a country, like in the United Kingdom, a Scottish referendum to leave, or in the United States, Puerto Rican independence, or things of that nature. Those would be direct, where the citizens are directly making a decision. You have parliamentary systems, in further into the democracies, you have parliamentary systems, which are basically people would vote off a single member district or proportional representation or some other method for members which would represent them. Basically, the people are voting for representatives to be the legislature, and then out of that legislature, the ruling party or coalition would select the executive branch. So there's not a lot of a difference between a legislative and an executive branch. They're kind of fused together. Well, with presidential systems, you have the representatives you select in whatever method as your legislature, but then you have citizens also electing an executive branch. So there's more independence between the executive branch and the legislative branch. They don't need to be at the same party or the same beliefs. And there's usually more in presidential systems, more discourse between legislature and the executive. So also, continue to look at more of power and authority. You have parliamentary sovereignty. This is the ability for a parliament to basically make whatever decisions they think fits. You're not going to have there's not a lot of, in certain parliamentary systems, especially without large national judiciaries that can make super decisions. The parliament is able to do whatever they feel is necessary without an executive overruling them, or sometimes a judge or the court overruling their ways. So it's just a lot of power for the parliament to do whatever they feel is necessary. Head of state, this is an important distinction when comparing governments. Head of state usually is more ceremonial. It's basically the figurehead of a nation. This could be in certain systems, it's a monarch, like the king of Great Britain, or you have, or the United Kingdom, or you have certain other figureheads, like kings of certain places, or queens, who would be those figureheads. And then you have the head of government, which is more the day-to-day operations. In the United Kingdom, it would be the prime minister. In presidential systems, you have the head of state and head of the government. It's both. Certain systems, there might be debated more, like specifically in Russia. You have a head of state. Could that be the president? Most likely, head of government, maybe that's more the prime minister. Although in Russia specifically, it's kind of, they're kind of, there's not really a large distinction. You might be able to find this in other countries, such as other countries, possibly like Iran. Actually is a good example. It's kind of more blurred between supreme leader and president, and it's not really, as set of an example. But yeah, that's just the general idea. Head of state, that figurehead of the government, figurehead of the government, figurehead of the state. And the head of government, basically the day-to-day person running the operations, the person who's in charge a lot in the government, and in the daily life of the state. Now, checks and balances usually would go between these branches. Most of the times in democratic societies, there's a executive, a legislature, and a judicial branch. Parliamentary system is more of that fusion between that executive and legislative, so not as many checks and balances, but theoretically, all three of those areas of society are supposed to check each other out, and that's the main idea of separation of powers. And as I was mentioning, Russia, semi-presidential systems, where you still have a strong prime minister, but you have a powerful president. Those are what could be considered semi-presidential systems. Um, in more of authoritarian states, you'd have elites in power. I mean, that could also be true of democratic societies, just basically more elite people ruling the country. Um, Communism is one example of a different type of government, or a lot more. It's looking compared to a democratic society, a lot more towards equality rather than individual freedoms and such, which are pretty strong in democratic societies. And that's more, and that is a large sense in the economy. Corporatism, basically looking out to try to reach out to corporations within the country to, you know, before those government changes, how can the corporations and the government have a better relation? Patron client systems where someone pays a leader of a country, or politically gives some loyalty towards the leader of the country, well, they can get a job in maybe the bureaucracy or some other top place in the government. And this usually is more seen in authoritarian governments, but it can also be true in democratic governments. Totalitarianism is usually more of a group of people, seen in authoritarian governments, where a government's trying to keep control of a large amount of power, going all out, any most means necessary to keep the power, to keep their ideals or push their ideals. You'd see military rule in some countries, when it's not just the leader in a democratic or authoritarian country. You could see military rule, the military takes control. You might have some powerful individuals or some people who support them running the bureaucracy in the day-to-day life. And maybe the military could promise, stability in certain times where there's instability in a country, or economic growth or something of that nature. Coup d'etats usually help begin the military rule. It's like the coup d'etats are like huge events where there's a lot of force used. It doesn't have to be physical, but it could be a threat of it to remove a leader, and usually military force to remove a leader and instate someone new as leading a country. And then you have co-optation, where you're having this, it's ways that the government can relate more towards the people, and types of, like, the ruling of the society, or like the jobs. An example of this is the patron clientelism, you know, support to the leader, and then once that leader takes control of the country, that leader can help you back and give you a top job or a top position in the government that you helped benefit and